Hey gang, and welcome to another awesome Dueling Rabbits Productions video about drawlooms and double harness weaving. Those of you who follow the studio's Instagram feed will be aware that major to-doings are afoot. Looms are being taken apart, moved, put back together again, and fine-tuned so they can be the best that they can be. While all these ructions are happening, I thought it might be a good time to answer some questions I've been receiving about drawlooms generally and drawloom sheds in particular. Today's video, intended for new and aspiring drawloom weavers, is all about perfecting the damask shed on shaft and combination drawlooms. If you've ever pressed a treadle and got this, rather than this, my hope is this vid will help you on your way. Let's imagine for a moment that we're confronted with an unfamiliar loom or have lost the instructions that conveniently tell us what all our measurements should be. How high should we hang our ground shafts? Where should our pattern leashes go? We can take a lot of guesswork out of our setup by considering how our two harnesses work together before we even beam our warp, no matter who made our drawloom or where it came from. For this exercise, we need a length of twine, weighted at either end, long enough to reach from the breast beam all the way to the back beam. This raises our first question. How high should the back beam be? On most drawloom extensions, there's a mechanism for raising or lowering the beam to its optimal height. A good starting point for full-size Swedish-style looms is about 3 inches higher than the breast beam. We'll discuss the full implications of raising or lowering our back beam down the road. Our next task is to determine the approximate height of our ground shafts when they are at rest. We only need to hang one to collect the necessary data. Recall that on a drawloom, the ground shafts are fitted with long eye heddles. Also recall that the ground shafts operate with a rising shed. Each warp end must pass through its ground heddle at the bottom of the long eye. We'll use our reference line to figure out how far the upper shaft bar should be from the floor. If the line is too low or too high in the heddle eye, we adjust the cord from the overhead jack until the shaft is hanging at the correct height. When we're satisfied, we measure the distance from the floor to the top of the upper shaft bar and make a note for future reference. This will be the starting point for all our ground shafts after the loom is warped. Now, the pattern leashes. We're going to estimate the height of the foremost pattern shaft so we have an idea where the rest should hang when we dress the loom. We'll hang a single pattern heddle with its lingo on the shaft closest to the front of the drawbridge. Note that the heddle is very long and the standard eye is located at the halfway point. We're going to imagine our reference line is a warp end sloping up to the back beam. The goal here is to have the line pass through the pattern heddle in line with, or slightly below, the bottom of the long eye heddle in front of it. Our lingo will pull the warp end towards the floor. This ensures that when the pattern leash is raised, it will travel the full height of the long eye and allow for the largest possible shed at weaving time. It may take some finessing to get the height of the pattern shaft right, but when it is, most drawbridges have a guide of some sort so that all the shafts can be ranked to the back of the loom without the bother of measuring every one. It also serves as a guide for cutting our draw cords if we're installing them for the first time. So even before we warped whatever drawloom we have, we've already got 3 measurements: the height of the back beam relative to the breast beam, the distance from the floor to the upper shaft bars of the ground harness, and the distance from the floor to the tops of the pattern leashes. Now we can beam our warp, thread our heddles, and deploy our leashes to their final position. Sometime later, our loom looks like this. Here's my current setup. My ground structure is 6-end irregular satin, so I have 6 ground shafts at the front of the loom here. Behind, are 41 pattern shafts threaded in a couple of different configurations and some single unit pulls for non-symmetrical borders. The warp is nicely tensioned and exhibits its characteristic curves inside the threaded points. Let's see if all my shenanigans with the reference line on this loom paid off. The warp is traveling in a straight line from the breast beam, through the reed and the beater, and through the ground heddles where it lies at the bottom of the long eyes. It continues on to the pattern heddles, where the warp begins to dip ever so slightly. The pattern heddles are extended to their full length and are not baggy above the warp. As the warp continues to the back beam, it takes an upward turn. When it is through the pattern heddles and no longer weighted by lingos, the slope can become steep indeed. We'll discuss how to optimize this slope in a few minutes. First, let's confirm that our pattern leashes are at the correct height. We know that we want to be able to make full use of our long eye heddles and that, when leashes are raised, their associated ends should be at the tops of the heddle eyes. On my console, shafts at the front of the loom are attached to pull handles on the left, with the shafts behind ranking off to the right. So I'll pull a few shafts at various points fore and aft to ensure they are all lifting to where they need to go. And they are. We can see that when the handles have been pulled, the ends are close to the tops of the long eyes. We need to keep in mind that, when we have a lot of pattern shafts, the loom's geometry is such that shafts to the rear will need to be lifted higher than shafts at the front to bring the warp ends to the same height in the long eyes. Drawbridges typically have some way to accommodate this requirement, usually by increasing the distance between the pull handles for the rearward shafts and the hook bar. To avoid the need for adjusting 50-odd pattern shafts individually, drawbridge consoles usually have a way of raising or lowering both the handles and the hook bar, as well as adjusting the angle between them for optimum mechanics. While we're at it, we can double-check the single unit leashes. We want these leashes to be raised to the same height as the pattern shaft leashes when they're pulled. Again, the loom will have some way of adjusting the height both of the leashes at rest and the height to which they are pulled. But this seems pretty good for now, and we can always fine-tune it later on. Now that we've established that our ground shafts and pattern leashes are where they need to be, it's time to finesse the back beam. Is it too low or too high? How can we tell? For this exercise, we need our trusty reference line again. We bypass the heddles this time, but in all other respects suspend it between the breast and back beams as before. We pass the line through the reed in the beater. For illustrative purposes, I've installed the back beam a bit lower than I know it needs to be. Here's the line from the side, traveling from the front to the back of the loom. You can see that its path skirts above the warp at rest. If I pull some pattern shafts, you can see the shed, but notice that our reference line is much closer to the neutral warp ends than to the raised ones. This means our back beam is too low. So I'll raise it a little. That's better, but our reference line is still not quite halfway between. I'll move the back beam up as far as it will go, and perfect. My shed is now open equally above and below my reference, and I am ready for the next step. To review, we've hung our ground shafts where they need to be and adjusted the height of our pattern leashes to accommodate the depth of the loom. We've established the operating height of our back beam. Now it's time for the final step, which can be the most problematic for many weavers, the lower tie-up. Before we tackle it, let's remind ourselves of what we're trying to do. Here's the tie-up for the current setup from my perspective at the front of the loom. These rows represent the 6 ground shafts, and the columns represent my 6 treadles. Each treadle has only 2 connections. The X's represent connections to short lambs, and the O's represent connections to long, lower lambs. Pressing the leftmost treadle which is closest to the camera, will cause shaft 5 to go up and shaft 2 to go down. Because of our long eye heddles, the practical upshot of this tie-up is that when no pattern shafts are raised, our ground shafts will weave with a rising shed. Every time we press a treadle, one shaft only will go up, raising one thread in every 6 for our ground structure. Even though we are at the same time lowering a shaft, the long eye heddle will pass past its warp end, leaving it in place at the bottom of the shed. So let's test our ground shaft tie-up. We'll do this one treadle at a time, and at first we'll only look at the rising shafts. There's not a whole lot that can go wrong at this point. I press treadle 1 and observe that the ends on shaft 5 are raised. They don't need to go too high. They just need to make a shed sufficient to pass my damask shuttle through. Ideally, the treadle should just touch the floor when the shed is at its max. So that's fine. If I'm not happy with the height of this shed, I would fix it by adjusting the connection that runs from the treadle to the lower lamb. The ceiling of the shed was too low, for example, I would shorten the cord. Often, just one hole in the Texolve will fix any problem. Toot de sweet. Now let's look at what the sinking shed on that same treadle is doing. The only danger here is that the shaft might get pulled down too far and drag its associated threads below the level of the shed floor. If that happens, we simply lengthen the cord running from the treadle to the short lamb associated with shaft number 2. Again, we want the treadle to touch the floor before it pulls ends beyond where they need to be. I find that by examining each treadle's tie-ups systematically, looking at each shed separately, it is a simple matter to make the necessary adjustments. Practice helps. It can be tempting to move too quickly and shorten or lengthen cords too much. I find a slow, minimal approach works best. It's also important to keep the entire setup as low as possible. If it feels like we are fighting resistance from the loom or the treadles are not hitting the floor when they are pressed, cords should be lengthened so that no overreaching occurs, putting unnecessary strain on the warp. So once we are satisfied with the treadle tie-ups for our ground cloth, it is time to make sure our pattern sheds are also doing what they're supposed to. Let's think about what we're trying to do now. To weave pattern, we raise our leashes so that the warp travels to the tops of the long eye heddles. Our pattern harness operates with the sinking shed. For raised units, a sinking shaft will lower one end in 6 to the floor of the shed. 99 times out of 100, this is where drawloom weavers will find issues with their setup, although if we've been diligent so far, we shouldn't have too much trouble. The goal here is to ensure that when we press a treadle, our sinking warp ends are brought to the same level as the warp ends at rest to make a solid shed floor. It is my personal experience that the most common problem here is that pattern ends are initially lowered too much, like these have been. If we try to weave like this, we will have snagged threads and diving shuttles everywhere. The solution is to lengthen the cord from the treadle in question to the associated ground shaft's short lamb. And that's pretty much it. We're ready to weave. Now, I know folks are watching this thinking I'm making it look too simple. Well, here we go. I've gone back and deliberately sabotaged my first treadle so that we can troubleshoot in real time a shed where pretty much nothing is working the way it should. Here we go. All right, so this is the first thing I'm doing. I'm lifting up pattern shafts. And as you can see, these are now at the tops of the long eye heddles, which is where I want them to be. If that's the size of my shed, I'm going to be able to get my shuttle through just fine. Let's see what happens when I step on a treadle. All right, I've got all sorts of problems here. Let's look at the top of the shed first. This is the top of the shed. And you can see that it's not coming up anywhere as far as the pattern shaft units. So I need to shorten that. I'm going to shorten it quite a lot and we're going to see what happens. Now I've really shortened it a lot. That's the connector to the long lamb. Now, I do have a nice shed, so that's good, but look, it's going up above my raised units. So there's a good possibility that I'm going to maybe snag them or cause problems. I really don't need it to come up that far. I just want it to come up to the level of the raised units. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to lengthen that cord to the long lambs by, I don't know, say 2. Okay. Now let's see what happens. Still a little high, maybe. You can lower them. One. Let's try that. I'm pretty happy with that. It's not too high. I don't think I'm going to catch. That seems good. In fact, I could probably bring it down one more. So that's what I'm going to do. So as now I'm lengthening it one more hole. And I think that that's going to be fine. Let's leave it at that for now. And that's pretty close. Pretty close. Now, what about this? I have threads that are coming below. There's the floor right there. But these are too low. Don't want them to go down that far. So now I'm going to take my short lamb and I'm going to lengthen it. A fair amount, actually. Okay, let's try that. That looks pretty good to me. That's definitely better. I might lengthen it one more. And the nice thing is that by doing that, I'm lowering my treadle too. Now, this is not coming too far, and my treadle, coincidentally, is just hitting the floor now. And that's pretty much perfect. I did that in real time. It didn't take long. Once we've checked our 5 other sheds similarly, we're ready to weave, and weave we shall, confident that our Drawloom is tuned as finely as it can be. Thank you as always for watching. See you again soon.